And so then depending on which regulation you follow, like for example in NIS2, there is definitely supervision from the European regulator in that sense, and there can be penalties, financial penalties, or maybe penalties that you're stripped from the rights to trade in the financial market, all of that. So if we then zoom in on these risk management measures, a regulation like NIS2 even mentions the minimal list of things that you should focus on, that you should do. And broadly speaking, there are two categories. On the one hand, you have organizational measures that you should take, things like regular risk analysis, very important, or you should have procedures to know how to handle incidents, all of that. And then there are more technical stuff to be done, like applying cryptography, applying access control policies, asset management, supply chain security, all of that. So to recap, the bad news is it's a lot, especially with something like NIS2. For some companies, it's all of a sudden that they have to adhere to something like that. The good news is there is this central core of things that you should do, and by now we know how to do these things. And the first step in a typical approach really is that risk analysis. You should always start with thinking, what is important to my organization? And that's completely different from a manufacturing environment compared to a SaaS vendor like we are ourselves, for example. You should think, what are your crown jewels? What do you have to protect? Think in terms of confidentiality, integrity, availability, and then go from there. And then secondly, make sure that you have incident handling processes, because it's not a question of if, but rather when an incident will happen these days. So you should know how to handle and how to act in those situations. And then thirdly, think of those risk management measures that decrease your cybersecurity risk the most and apply those first. And so if you think back to the start of my presentation, if you act like that, if you think like that, then taking control over users, permissions, and so on will be one of the first things that you will do. And that means that you will have to have visibility over those levers, whether there are still orphaned accounts. You have to know who has administrative rights. You have to know who can access privacy-sensitive data. You have to know whether no one can commit fraud by both submitting and approving contracts, or which guest account, robots accounts are active. All of those things, you have to know that and then minimize them. Ideally, there should be no orphaned accounts, or ideally the amount of people with admin rights is minimal, and that's applying least privilege. That's the security mindset in identity and access management. But then briefly, if you look at the market of IAM, you see that the typical focus was not this. It's rather on automating so-called joiner mover lever flows. It's about if someone enters your organization, you see that in the HR system, and then automatically accounts are created wherever needed. If they leave, then they're automatically removed. If they move, then again the permissions are assigned or adjusted. And it's all very valuable. If you're an enterprise of tens of thousands of employees and you have to do this, there's just not enough sysadmins in the world to do all of that provisioning work manually. But the security value, the fact that you lower your risk, comes at the very end of a very long, tedious process. Typically, we're talking about multi-year, multi-million projects where you have to set up all of these connectors, design a role model, think about who should actually be able to do what, and the security value is at the very end there. So as a result, especially in smaller companies with smaller security teams, you see that user access management is just a bit waved away these days. And then you see things like a company of 500 people, maybe 1,000 Active Directory accounts that are still active, 2,000 guest accounts, file shares shared all over the place, SharePoint that is open to share with anyone. Those are actual security risks, and those show that you're not in control of user access. So, small part about Elimity. We're a product vendor and we try to solve this problem, of course. We try to provide an approach that is more lightweight. Lightweight identity governance is the fancy word then. And so that lightweight approach is really rooted in the fact that we look at this problem as a data problem and not as an automation problem. So we don't do, or our platform doesn't do the same as a SailPoint or an Armada or something. There's no provisioning in there. That's actually the major feature that we just got, but it really focuses on showing you visibility of who can currently do what in all of your systems in a matter of days, so you can then review, identify risks, maybe include other people in that exercise through the form of access reviews, clean up those risks, monitor over time, everything ideally that you should do to show that you're in control, but with a much lower total cost of ownership. And so in that sense, we work with both companies of several hundreds of employees that have to do a lot with a small security team, up to companies of tens of thousands of employees that want to further strengthen their internal security and internal policies and risk. And so the platform very briefly focuses on really those things that I just mentioned. A strong focus on making it as easy as possible to gather the data. You don't want to waste time on that. And then make it easy to understand who can currently do what, identify risks, indicate necessary changes, monitor over time, and run your access reviews. And the essence here is that this should turn around the typical IGA journey, where you start off with these very expensive, heavy steps like two-way provisioning connectors, deploying a large platform, thinking of a role model of who should do what, but rather you focus on identifying access risks as quickly as possible. So you can then review that, both for the security team, as well as the application owners, site owners, data owners, whatever that fits your governance structure, so that you can then address violations, lower your risk, get notified of new violations by putting on monitoring, again, to lower your risk as quickly as possible. And only then, that's at least my vision, only then think of the very expensive steps like designing role models, designing separation of duty policies, setting up governance, setting up provisioning and so on. And of course, if you want to do that, there are perfectly fine platforms out there like an Enter ID is awesome these days to complement this, but at least you should have governance, you should have visibility for the complete set of your landscape and all of your architecture. So for the rest of the presentation, I thought it would be valuable to go a bit deeper into what this approach in practice actually looks like. And so for this presentation, I decided on a case study of a company of around 2,000 employees. And in this case, so this is one of those companies with a smaller security team, at least in respect to or compared to the complexity that they're actually facing. They had to do a lot with a smaller team, but still they wanted to decrease cyber risk, show compliance, because they were in a highly regulated sector. And so in such a case, such a context, our approach is typically these 5 steps. And step 1 is what you heard me say a lot already, is that visibility. You want to go as quickly as possible to an understanding, an overview of your top 5, top 10 systems, let's say, and the users, the permissions, the roles, whatever that is in there. And in this case, well, we always think along with the customer from that risk management, that risk analysis that I talked about before. In this case, it was pretty standard. So Active Directory, Azure AD, Azure as a cloud environment as well. And then these guys wanted to focus on the local admins, so all of the admins that you have on the different servers. That was information that we got from Intune or SCCM in this case, I think. And then also database admins. What you also see a lot is file shares and SharePoint, for some reason very hot these days to take control over that. But whatever is important for you, that's the information that you want to get into this data foundation, we like to call it, as quickly as possible. And then we also advise you to take into account the HR system, because that gives you a sense of all of the people in your organization, gives you a lot of interesting metadata for risk analysis, like the end date, whether they're still active, the job title, the function description, the manager name, all of that. You link all of the accounts of the different systems to the person, and then you get an overview of, from the perspective of your actual people, who can now do what. And so that's your basic data foundation, identity data graph, if you want. And on that, we then typically apply a framework of security controls, 8 categories of security controls that we apply. And I can give a presentation of 2 hours on this topic by itself, but if you want to take a look at our guide. From my experience, the 4 most important ones are definitely the orphaned accounts, and then the privileged accounts, and then the combination of that, the privileged orphaned accounts, that's definitely something that you don't want to have in your organization. And then around financial systems or in a financial sector, definitely segregation of duty, because that avoids the possibility of fraud. And then there's always business-specific policies, things that you know that are very important for your organization. Things like maybe separation between geographies or between brands, or segregation between the production and the test environment, all of that. You probably know what systems are there. Those are the controls that you want to apply to that data. So you then end up with all of that data in one place, easy to navigate, but also a view of where your major risks are. And the goal of that is really to have a perfect starting spot, starting place for where you should put your cleanup efforts. And as I said, definitely if there are orphaned admin accounts, those are the things that you see here on the top of this list, definitely. And then if you want to go deeper into the details, you can go for example, outliers, where you look at the people in a certain team and see where some people can do way more than their direct colleagues. That's probably a leftover of a faulty mover process, because people only move throughout the organization, get more and more permissions and never been revoked. Those are risks that you want to address. And so in this specific customer case that we were talking about, there the CISO had a strong focus on Active Directory. This is just an image of their Active Directory only. And in a few days, well, actually in just an hour you have that data. In a few days they identified important risks that shouldn't be there, like accounts that shouldn't be there, members of critical groups that shouldn't be there. And after 1 week they could say, well, we fundamentally improved our cybersecurity posture. And that was really important to the CISO in this case, because identity and access management has a ring to it, has an image of being slow, a lot of effort, a lot of work. And this really bought them a lot of goodwill with the business to see, well, we're not doing just access reviews of everything out there. It will not take you hours. We focus on the most important risks first. And from there, they then evolved into the other systems that I had on the slide before, from Entra ID, Azure itself, the other data, and so on. And that's really the feedback loop that you see there. You go for first visibility, for investigation and cleanup, and then a typical deployment grows step by step into more and more data, more and more coverage of the architecture and the landscape. That's one thing. And then the second thing that you see, so steps 4 and 5, is that at some point in this process, the security team doesn't know everything anymore. So at the start, we focus on those security controls that you've seen before. But if there comes a list of, let's say, 300 accounts that fit the profile of an orphaned account, deciding whether it should really be disabled or can be removed even, that's not something that the security team can do by themselves. So in that case, you have to involve others in that process as well. People like team leaders, line managers, application owners, maybe owners of sites in SharePoint, owners of folders on the SharePoint. Those have the responsibility for those parts of the complete governance. And in that case, you want to involve them, but not by smacking them down with a complete overview of all the data, but in the form of what is called an access review. So this is a pretty well-known process within identity and access management, where you make an overview of, for example, the accounts of the people in a certain team, or who can access a certain, let's say, site or folder or application, and then you send over that overview to the owner of that piece of the organization, and he or she should just review that and give feedback on what the changes are that should be made, turn that into maybe ITSM tickets or automatically act on that, and so on. This is a process that we see that some organizations, some of our customers, were doing manually before, by maybe have some poor sysadmin export something with PowerShell and then put that in an Excel sheet. Someone should cut it into pieces, send it over to everyone, and then follow up. Well, here the platform really shines because it just automates that whole effort, so you can focus on the actual contents, and that's really important. And so in the general approach in step 4, at least our advice is to first focus on those risks that you've seen before. Again, do not push an overview of all the AD groups, which are very technical and probably just polluted all over the place, into the email inbox of a line manager. They will just click, yeah, I don't know what this is, accept and proceed. But rather focus on the risks. Say, well, we from the security team, we've seen these potentially risky accounts. These are the ones that belong to your team. Can you take a look whether these are still needed? That's a much more specific question. It will buy you a lot of goodwill. And that's how you include these people that actually don't want to waste time on this, but they have to. You include them step by step. And that's a perfect training opportunity as well. You really have to hold their hand in this process. And so at some point, you then end up in a situation where your major risks are cleaned up. And then it goes into step 5, where you put on the more continuous monitoring, more continuous governance, where you maybe repeat this exercise for maybe the complete set of all the accounts in a team and their groups and so on, or repeat this every 3 months, 6 months, every 12 months, depending on your risk appetite. And of course, what is very important in this slide is the 2 days and the 7 days for steps 1 and 2. That's really important to get to that visibility and the first results as quickly as possible. But I have to be honest, phase 4 is a lot longer than is shown here. I couldn't just fit it on the slide. That's where you include people in this process. You have to educate them. You have to take them through it. That's, of course, a situation or a procedure that is a lot more work than just including data in the platform. So that's our general approach. And I always like to end these presentations with a bit of homework. So We make a platform specifically for this. You're not obliged to use it, of course, but even if you don't use it with our platform, at least take a look at this problem as a data problem. And so what I recommend you to do, if you get back to the office, is to first start with that risk analysis. I would hope that everyone in the room here has already done that, so you should know what your critical systems are and so on. And then secondly, make it a data exercise. Have someone or a platform that you have collect the data, meaning collect the users, the permissions in your critical systems, then apply the essential security controls. Again, take a look at our guide. I think that the QR code is again on the next slide, but at least look for orphaned accounts, privileged accounts, and segregation of duty, and then act on that. And then finally, and very important, but I see so many people that do all of these steps but don't do step 5, monitor. Meaning that if you clean up risks, repeat steps 2 and 3 to show that you are improving. That's where the value is. That's where you buy goodwill, where you build goodwill. That you're showing that, well, the amount of accounts is going down, the amount of risks is going down. That's where you show that you're improving over time. Because for most of these regulations, you don't have to be perfectly in order from the start, but you do have to show that you're putting the effort in, that you're improving. And that's where you do the monitoring. And of course, if you want to do this process efficiently, come take a look at our booth and our platform. We're at booth F43. There is beer there. This year we brew our own Elimity beer, or at least we had someone brew it, but we decided to taste. I kind of like it, so come take a look. And if you want, that's the QR code to the security controls. And maybe even if you still think that this effort is too much for your organization, also know that we, or at least our partners, help us apply this as what we call an identity security assessment. So that's where some of our partners come into your organization with our product, connected to the systems, give you a nice report out of that, together with a working interface to really start working and improving on those risks after just a few days. And that's everything that I wanted to talk about. If there are any questions, and I think we still have time. Yeah, we have 5 minutes. Perfect. In any case, thank you for your attention.